So thank you for joining me, everybody, today. I know quite a few people couldn't come due to the timings of the event, but we will be sending out a recording for everybody after this webinar. So the purpose of this really is not to talk about coaching, but to more specifically kind of look at the risk type compass within that, where that might lie, how looking at that decision-making aspect of personality can be helpful in those coaching situations. So how maybe that applies to a model that someone already has, and it might be interesting to hear from some people whether they use it already or how they might think the risk type compass is best placed in the work that they do already. So what I want to talk about first is just looking briefly at why personality, why would we use any personality tool within coaching, just really briefly to cover that, and then looking at decision-making and risk appetite within coaching, why that's helpful, why do we want to look at that specifically, and then looking more at some coaching strategies for leadership and team development, maybe looking more towards like different case studies or how really we can start to apply our risk type compass tool. And then I'll just wrap up at the end and take any questions that anybody has. So starting with why personality, why would we want to look at this within that coaching process? So here, here we're looking at, say, 250 people on the beach or a couple of hundred people on the beach, but what is it that really makes them stand out when we start to look at their different characteristics, when we start to kind of zoom in on those different individuals? What might we get from that? It starts to mean that, you know, there's more than meets the eye with an image like this. So the more we can find out about people, the more interesting it becomes, the meatier this image is. If we start to realize, how did they get to the beach? Did one person wake up last minute, throw the towels in the car and drive there? Did someone else plan this way in advance, book train tickets, get discounts off? But, you know, really zooming in and understanding the individuals that we have creates a more interesting image. So yes, hundreds of people on a beach, but who do we have on this beach? Who is in the room? What decisions are they making? What personality characteristics are they carrying? So really just trying to make the image a bit more interesting. And this relates to kind of why we'd want to use personality assessments. It gives us something extra. It does make that coaching session more interesting. It gives us these strategies that we can base on evidence. Often these personality assessments will come from the 5-factor model of personality, which is that global standard. And we want to be using reliable and valid tools, ones that really do give us that evidence that we can say is generalizable to other populations or globally, and start to then create those strategies based on this evidence, on those personality traits that we know can be measured reliably. It can also help us understand the client before we go into that conversation. So what questions might we have from having looked at their report? What pieces to the puzzle can we not work out ourselves? What do we need them to confirm? It gives us different areas we might want to probe, want to look at. And also, you know, in some scenarios, it might make us understand a bit better how they might start to respond to the feedback that we are going to give them. Then it's going to provide a clear framework and structure to follow. So, you know, giving us something that we can navigate through, looking at that report and where we are going to go through it can be really helpful. And again, asking those questions around those different areas. And finally, creating that strategic self-awareness. So the evidence that we use, it can really help them to understand themselves better, understand their strength areas, and help them to take that personal responsibility for what they are doing. So with that in mind, I want to talk a bit more about kind of the risk type compass as a personality assessment and how that might come into it. So what are the benefits of highlighting decision-making and risk appetite within coaching? So firstly, looking at how many decisions do we make in a day? So if you type this into Google, it's going to come up with around 35,000 decisions. That's a huge number. Things that maybe we don't consider we're doing, from boiling the kettle in the morning, to how we get to work, what transport are we using, to the decisions that we make when we're at work, how we lead a team, how we manage a team. So we make a huge amount of decisions a day, and they really do range drastically. And we all bring this unique bias to that. We all have our own way that we go about making these decisions. And why wouldn't we want to know that? Why wouldn't we want to know how we approach these different scenarios? So I want to get you thinking, first of all, about some different scenarios for yourself, whether you know your risk type, whether you are a trained user with us or not. So first of all, cycling to work, cycling in rush hour. Is that something you think you would do? Or if you do, how would that be? Would you try and find a good time to leave? Would you maybe go last minute? Would you just jump on a bike and not think about it? Do you wait at the amber light, or do you kind of go through it? It's kind of asking ourselves how we might approach that scenario. I know myself, on some days, probably yes, I would. And on others, I would start to question things and go, is that too dangerous? Is it too busy out on the roads? So we are all going to approach these slightly differently. Another one that can be really helpful to look at is think about, how do you travel? When you book a holiday, do you book far in advance? Do you kind of wing it and go last minute? Do you rely on your partner or your family to kind of do all the detailed side planning, or is that you? Are you that individual? Even when it comes to going to the gate, do you wait till that last boarding call, or do you get there early? Do you like to be there an hour before? We all just approach this in a completely different way. So think about yourself, but think about, a partner you might travel with or friends you might travel with, and how you all like to approach that scenario slightly differently. And finally, another example, maybe more related to the workplace then, but change. Just when things are changing, it's what I'm trying to represent with these arrows, things going off in different directions. We're all going to approach that slightly differently. Some people thrive off change. They see it as an opportunity. They see something to kind of ride off there. Other people really don't like it. They're therefore going to become more change resistant because they haven't got the control. They don't like the ambiguity that comes alongside that. So thinking maybe if things have changed for you last minute recently, things at work, things at home, how do you tend to respond to that? So I know I, again, would have more of a stress reaction first, and then tending to be quite open-minded about it. So I can see how that might be different to some of my colleagues that I work with here. So really the point I'm trying to get at is that we make thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of decisions a day, and we all bring this different, unique bias to it. So if we can see that that might be different in a travel context, in a cycling context, then it's definitely going to be different in a work context. So why wouldn't we want to be able to use this when we are coaching someone? And really what we're doing underneath all of this is weighing up risk and opportunity. It becomes like a constant balancing act between what are the risks involved in that scenario, but what are the opportunities, what are the payoffs, what are the rewards. So we're kind of constantly trying to balance that to decide what decisions we're going to make. And sitting underneath that is our unique bias that we bring. So some people do have more of a bias that will tilt the scales more towards seeing risk. So it's harder for them to balance the opportunity in there, and vice versa. Some people seeing the opportunity more easily and needing some help to balance the risks involved. And decision making is really kind of made up around these two things, how we are looking at these two scenarios and how we are balancing them. So what this affects is the decisions we make, but it also then impacts the people around us. So in a work context, it impacts the team. And we can also look at this to see what are the wider implications of that. So especially, as leaders, what does that start to look like to the team, and then to all the teams within that organization? Have we created then a risk culture there based on these biases that we have that we perhaps aren't aware of? So I think it is really important when we're looking at leaders, and obviously coaching can often be at that senior level. But when we're looking at leaders, they make hundreds of decisions a day at work that they need to, and they probably play a real key role in the success of the organization in terms of productivity as well. So these leaders, you think of it like the scales, are continuously weighing up the costs and benefits of situations. So if they know they have that slight bias towards the risk, how does that affect then the decisions that they make? Do they try and get someone around them who maybe is focused more on opportunity to help them kind of tip the scales slightly? So what we are going to discuss, and I know a lot of individuals watching this are already risk compass trained, but for those who aren't, just to kind of go over what we're looking at here. So the risk type compass has two underlying scales to it. So there are two sides to decision making. You have the emotional side to decision making. So at one end, you have the intense risk type. So these individuals are risk averse because they see things as kind of threat or loss or danger. They want to prevent risks from happening. So emotional individuals who invest a lot passionately, but may then start to maybe dwell on things that have gone wrong. So this is very much like a feel response. And on the other end of this feel response is the composed risk type, who are more confident and calm and composed, as it says, so having that even temperedness. So they tend to be more kind of resilient and consistent, and more easily they can kind of take things on board. So risk for them is just something to get on with. Often they might see it more as opportunity. They're more risk taking in that way. And then on the other scale, you have cognition, or more of maybe a think response, more of your head versus your heart. So the cognition scale, again, is looking at the prudent risk type on one end. So these individuals are from our measured factor. So these individuals like to be in control. They don't like ambiguity. They're risk averse because they don't like the unknown. So when they can't have control of that, they might feel more uncomfortable when they're making decisions, but they like to be informed. They like to plan ahead and have a system in place. Whereas on the other end of the scale, you're going to have the carefree risk type, who are more daring. They tend to be more impulsive, open-minded and flexible. They don't like to have that kind of rule book that they need to follow. In fact, they like to kind of have the freedom of thought and be more innovative. So they're more risk-taking. They see those opportunities. So looking at those scales, very much more towards the opportunity side of that scale. And what we have falling in between these, what we call pure risk types then, are the complex risk types. So you can be a combination of two of the pure ones. So for example, I'm an excitable risk type. So I sit somewhere between the intense and the carefree risk type. What this means is I have kind of a risk averse heart or feeling response in a way. So when something goes wrong, I can feel that quite strongly, or I have an emotional response. I'm quite passionate about things. But my carefree kind of head or thought process makes me want to be quite open and flexible and take those risks. So it's a real balancing act between how the head and the heart play out. So in the blue here represented are the complex risk types. So again, the wary would be a combination of that intense risk type and that prudent risk type. So they're the most risk averse because they have two reasons to be risk averse. One from an emotional level and one from a cognitive level. So around this risk type, around our 360 spectrums, this creates our risk type compass. The further you are to the outer edge, the stronger your risk type characteristics are going to be. But just to make the point that it's not that you're more, some people in this compass take risks and some don't. Everyone takes risks because within every decision we make, as I said, we're weighing up this risk and opportunity. So it's not about kind of what you do, but how you do it. So just because there's a really high risk job, it doesn't mean, say, a prudent risk type who would prefer to be in control and have all that kind of details in front of them can't do it. They're just going to take those risks in a calculated, controlled way, making sure they've done their homework, making sure they have their method in place when they approach different decisions at work. And risk type is something that's of our nature. It's something that is part of our personality. It affects our perception of risk, our reaction to risk. It affects, how we then start to manage risk. It shows us how risk-taking we are, how risk-averse we are. So a wary risk type being the most risk-averse on the compass, but an adventurous risk type being the most risk-taking. And these different personality characteristics that we have are ultimately going to influence that decision-making process that we do or that we undertake at work, whether it's as a team member or whether it's as a leader. So with the risk type compass, looking at that, how that emotional side to us and our cognitive side to us play out together can be really helpful to understand how someone is likely to approach a decision. So we can do this starting at that individual level, looking at someone's strength areas, looking at perhaps where their blind spots are. What could they maybe be more aware of? What isn't in their bias? Are they just risk-averse? Do they never kind of look to the opportunities? Are they not open-minded? And then we want to see, when we understand ourselves and our strengths, how that then relates to the team around us. In understanding ourselves and our biases, we can then understand how they're different from someone else's. And then ultimately seeing that if we can have this kind of risk culture at an organizational level, what does that start to look like? Do we have an organization of people who are more risk taking, so falling maybe towards more of the bottom of the compass, or risk averse? And that's where we can use our risk type landscape tool. But with that kind of background on why we want to use personality assessments in the first place, and particularly then that decision-making risk appetite, goes back to my points at the beginning, is that we want these evidence-based strategies. The risk type compass is a very reliable and valid tool with a lot of evidence behind it to show it is looking at that emotional side and cognitive side of decision-making. We can then understand a lot more about our individual before we go in, understand how they are likely to approach decisions, and that can help us to start creating questions and understanding who we have in this coaching scenario. So using that and looking at how this is going to relate to some coaching strategies, I think with the risk type compass is really interesting because the word risk often draws people in. And I think the word risk is an area where, depending on where you've worked or different scenarios you've been in, this really does create these preconceptions. People start to create their own vocabulary around the word. So what is risk? It depends on a lot of things for that individual. And we start to build up a language around that. Maybe if we've worked in the finance industry our whole life, we view risk as investing clients' monies into portfolios. But within that, we're weighing up risk and opportunity, but we've created our own language around that. There's financial risk. That's what risk is to us. Or if we work in sales, maybe a risk is pitching to a new client and putting ourselves out there and putting ourselves on stage, making ourselves vulnerable. Maybe that's a risk for us. And we therefore build our vocabulary around that. What we can do with the risk type compass is give them new language to use to understand themselves, personality-based language. And it creates that clarity for them in a coaching situation. Showing them the risk type that they have and what that means is really important here. So applying subjective risk to this word risk that I think can often be thrown around nowadays. So with that said, I think the value of using risk type or getting someone to understand their risk type within coaching is getting them to navigate what I would say is a risk jigsaw, understanding their own risk-related behavior and understanding it objectively. So, if someone thinks I am someone who is very risky, then they take the risk type compass and it can tell you why or how, or is that an emotional risk? Is that because you're quite composed and confident? And that objective kind of risk type that they have, they can start to see how that's different to other people. And it gives them that language base then to understand that, okay, I am a composed risk type. So therefore, I'm someone who's quite even-tempered. I'm quite resilient. I know that I can kind of pick myself up in most scenarios, be the optimistic one. But maybe I don't evaluate risk as much as someone else who I work with. So giving them that vocabulary to kind of navigate how they're thinking, how they're feeling. And ultimately with this, like when I said in one of my original slides, with personality, getting to be aware of how they approach decision making and then taking responsibility for this. So really understanding themselves and taking personal responsibility. So how am I a risk taker? Like I said, it's not that only some people take risks. We all take risks. It's just all going to be in a different way. So what can I own? What can I bring to the table? Who am I in that room? Who am I on that beach? And I think with this, interestingly, individuals are then faced with this personal challenge of reining in this natural disposition. It's a part that's probably quite deeply rooted for people. And depending on where we work or what we do, your risk type is kind of sitting like the anchor under the boat. So in times of stress or pressure, we might well revert back to our risk type, making decisions in that way. So it's really important for people to understand where they're coming from or why they feel that way or why they might approach decisions in that way, depending on the job role that they do. And we're all going to then make those decisions slightly differently because we're managing our risk type bias. So talking about there was, I guess, more about how risk type can be helpful in coaching scenarios, or why, but here I just want to talk more about examples of different risk types. And this one is actually someone who I'd spoken to, but at an individual level, if I'm taking, I know this image on the right is just one of the bipolar scales that we have, but it's the cognitive scale. So just using this as an example, at one end, you have the carefree risk type. So they enjoy making quick decisions, being inventive, being in a scenario where they can be open and flexible. But they might have difficulty being in a repetitive routine. You know, they get easily bored and they don't like it. So that's what can get them to just get that job over with, so I can move on to something a bit more interesting. And that's where we can see that they might potentially start missing out on details. On the other end, you have that prudent risk type, and they like nothing more than a good routine. So opposite risk types on the scale are going to have opposite characteristics. So actually, that prudent risk type, when we have that discussion, we say that we might, you know, talk to them about the fact they do like having rules, they do like conforming, they do like to have time to get their details and evidence together, being more logical. So when they are in scenarios when they have to deal with an unexpected event, how does that feel like for them? Probably makes them quite uncomfortable. They don't want to be spontaneous. They don't want to act in a scenario that they don't know, that's unfamiliar to them. So you see, very different to the carefree risk type. So when I'm having a coaching scenario with a carefree risk type, it's going to look very different to this individual who's a prudent risk type. Because I can see quite clearly from this kind of objective evidence how they're approaching this decision differently, or these decisions they might make at work differently. So the carefree risk type that we explored their profile with, you know, the sorts of things I then started to ask was, you know, when there is a procedure, how do you ensure you follow it? What steps were they putting in place? They did have a job where there were regulations, where there were procedures. So when they were in those scenarios, how did they ensure they did them properly and didn't let that kind of easily bored nature take over? How did they ensure they were kind of open to the advice from more conservative colleagues? Making sure that they asked those questions, didn't just move on, get distracted and move on to the next thing. And then also often we can see, you know, they're very idea focused and wanting to find a new or different thing, be open to new or different ways of doing things. How do they then take the next steps and put them into action? And this individual said, actually, I work with someone who is a prudent risk type, and that works really nicely because they're the one who can help me with the details and rein it in. And what we came up with was, if they had this upcoming project that they had to do, maybe they should take that time out, write a list of the actions that they needed to do, so that when they had that feeling of, oh, I just want to get this done and move on, they could refer back to that list. It was almost like their grounding. So it wasn't change your risk type, it wasn't change who you are, but understand where your strengths lie. So the person who is easygoing and open and flexible, and able to adapt really quickly and see the opportunity in things. But when you need to follow a procedure, maybe make sure you are writing things down, you're ticking those things off. So at an individual level, we can see their decision making. The next step is to get them to understand what that looks like, how that affects other people, how that affects the team around them. So coaching leaders a lot of leaders will often be managing a team. So I want to take a different part of the compass now. So that was the cognitive scale, so they're pure risk types. But cutting down the middle is what we have is our risk tolerance index. So the wary risk type being the most risk averse on the compass, as I explained, and the adventurous risk type being the most risk tolerant or even risk taking. They combine being calm and confident with being open and flexible. So really they can just pick themselves up, dust themselves off when things go wrong, and they look for the next thing and they look for gaps in things. But they can do this very calmly with a lot of resilience. So firstly, if I'm talking to that wary risk type, let's say at an individual level, and they're aware that there's someone who sees the threat in things, they see the danger of going into something too quickly, they feel it more emotionally, they're more sensitive in that way. They're also someone who's more analytical, they like to have the method, they like to have the structure, get their details together. So combining that, they're very driven individuals. They're the people who bring the mission to the team because they really don't want things to fail for two reasons, their head and their heart, or their think and their feel. So, you know, for them, they can take that time out to process their emotions. They can start to maybe balance their planning with being open to change, letting them know things change. So as a leader, they need to be prepared to adapt to these decision-making styles. And also, we don't want them to get too bogged down in the detail. So there is detail, but we don't want them to go overboard with that. So if I take that and I apply it to then the team, so we want these wary risk types to continue driving the team forward to reach their goal. Like I said, they're the people who bring that mission, who want the people to kind of reach those goals. So to continue doing that as the leader. But we want them to maybe understand that they need to balance that decision-making between the group, lose some of that control that they really feel they need to have. And then start to think about maybe how their emotional response to stress can start to come across to others. If people see them flustered all the time as their leader, you know, what does that start to look like? Maybe they can take the time out to really consider their emotions, as we said, to process their emotions. So it's really getting them to understand how their decision making now is coming across to the team and how that's then going to affect the team. But again, if I do an opposite, if we're coaching the adventurous risk type, we might say to me, don't forget to consider the details of a project, because they do like to keep things going. They have that kind of impulsivity, wanting to move on, find new opportunities, but in a kind of calm, even-tempered way. So we're saying to them, don't jump in too quickly. Being someone who is confident and can see those opportunities, maybe when do they consider the details of it? Always acting on an impulse, does that make other people feel uncomfortable? Have they considered that? What does that look like to other people? Or even if they're kind of picking themselves up and getting on with the next thing, what if there's someone on their team who's wary, who actually, you know, needed a bit more time to process that and process mistakes and why it went wrong? And also what can come with this is distractibility of tasks. So how do they maintain their focus, not confusing activity with productivity, because there's probably a lot going on in their head of new opportunities and where they can go with things. And if we can then take that into the team context again, so we'd say to them, continue to use that resilience and confidence. They're going to be that anchor for the team in times of stress. They're going to be the person that people can go to. Creating that calmness for the team. But with that, you know, don't forget to show your emotions. Sometimes the team need to see that. Sometimes they want to really understand what went wrong and how they can improve it, and understanding who they have around them. So there might be individuals who are more towards that emotional side of the compass, who need time to process things, or who want to see the urgency that you have when making a decision, or if you've made a mistake as a team, how you can move on from it. And then often what can come with an adventurous risk type is a lot of confidence from that calm factor, confidence in the decisions that they make. But therefore, we'd say, how often do you balance that with the team, or how do you make sure that everyone equally gets involved? So I guess the point here is we can take the individual and how they make decisions and their biases after exploring that with them, and then start to look at it in terms of the team that they have around them. How does that affect them? Who else do they have on the compass in their team? What might the wary person on the adventurous leader's team want from them as a leader? Because it's going to be something quite different to how they feel they can make decisions. And then ultimately, we can take this further to an organizational level. So what we kind of call this here is our risk type taxonomy. So I talked a bit about before how people view the word risk and what vocabulary they might have built up around that, and how the risk type compass, we're going to give them that clarity of here's some new language, here's some risk type language that has the evidence behind it to show the different traits that people have. So we're going to use that to create our risk type taxonomy. So what we can start to do is, when other people know each other's risk types, you build the foundations of a language that people can use, that they can communicate with, and it's then non-judgmental, and it's bespoke to that organization. It's bespoke to how they make decisions, bespoke to those risk types. And therefore it then can help people to take that personal responsibility, because everyone is aware of the language we're going to use, of the different risk type characteristics. So I'm an excitable risk type. What does that mean for me? What do I bring to my team here at work? And maybe what am I not so good at? And other people know my risk types. There's nowhere to hide. but it's not a judgmental environment. And the structure that you can create from that then gives more clarity. It helps people to manage their expectations. It helps them to communicate better. And the more consistent we can be with this, to get people to understand this taxonomy, is what can be really key here. So we work with a small consultancy of individuals, and they use the risk type compass, and they like to kind of use the language as they communicate with one another, saying, you know, this is better for you, you're much more prudent. And it becomes quite nice to see how that works for them. So people really taking that personal responsibility and understanding objectively where they sit in terms of those they work with. And I guess to cement that and what I'm talking about, if that's not clear, it's just some examples I came up with. So if someone's thinking, I'm way too prudent to jump into this, that's their thought process, they're aware of their risk type, taking that personal responsibility for it, then their manager or team member can say, Jen won't like this because we haven't given her enough time. They know she's a prudent risk type. They know that she likes to have that time to consider things, to not be confronted with ambiguity, to take control of different things. And that can then help how we communicate around the organization. Another example, I can do the last minute presentation. I don't mind being thrown into that. So some individuals, that sits quite well with them, probably not the prudent risk type. But then as a manager, you can say, we don't have much time for this project due to the last minute changes, but Ethan will definitely be happy to throw himself into this. So understanding who in our organization is probably going to bring their strengths to the table, and how can we communicate this? So we're using the risk type taxonomy, the risk type compass language in these phrases here. And then finally, you know, details don't bother me. I like to see how we change things up. So actually maybe as a manager, if we've got an individual like this, who isn't very detail oriented, who is more kind of flexible, open-minded, our feedback might be, you know, can you please try to slow down your decision making? Maybe use a colleague, and I mean, you could put anyone's name in, utilize Louisa's attention to detail, and use your differences as a sounding board. So really we're just giving a nice language framework that we can start to use within organizations. And it starts from that individual level of people understanding how they approach decisions, how they weigh up that risk opportunity, and how that then sits in the work that they do. So really to conclude and to summarize that, the risk type approach to coaching aims to develop self-awareness. It's, as I said, get people to take that personal responsibility, and it's for the risk-related aspects of their personality. So zooming in more to the decision-making process that people are going through at work, and recognizing for themselves, you know, the nature that they have. What are they fighting against, but also, you know, what strengths are they bringing? What can be really helpful for them at work, and how they approach decisions, and what maybe do they need to consider in different scenarios, in different decision-making scenarios. And as I've hopefully shown, this can be applied to the team level. So knowing yourself, and then knowing how you're different to other people. So our Risk Type Compass team report shows that, shows the different people on the team, where they're plotted. And it could be really interesting in those scenarios to pair opposite risk types up together, get them to really see how they are different. I think it's quite powerful, because if you have team conflict or issues with team dynamics, showing them that visual of, well, this might be where it's coming from, because this individual who is more of an intense risk type feels quite strongly about a lot of things. They want to make sure that we've considered all options, that we're not just going to jump in too quickly, and that things, you know, might go wrong. Versus someone who's composed, who never really sees that side, who doesn't necessarily address the risk, who just kind of goes along with things quite calmly, confident. So that can really start to highlight where those differences come from. And then looking at maybe the organizational culture, how that then starts to affect the entire organization. So that's where maybe a risk type taxonomy can come in, having that non-judgmental language that people can start to pick up and use. So hopefully that's a nice kind of short summary of where the risk type compass might come into the coaching scenario, looking at that decision-making side of personality. So I know it's a short and sweet webinar, but if there are any questions that you have, feel free to put them in the chat now, or if not, thank you for joining me, and you can drop me an email if you have any further questions, or if you want to discuss this in more detail. So yeah, if there's any questions, let me know. And thank you.